When a beloved Hollywood family comes back together after years of heartbreak, people expect tears, smiles, and emotional tributes. But nobody expected what happened when Meadow Walker stepped back into the world that made her father a global icon. What started as a celebration of Fast and Furious quickly turned into something much deeper. Because behind the hugs, the cameras, and the public memories, there were quiet moments that seemed to reveal another story entirely. And once fans noticed it, they couldn't stop talking about it. The Fast and Furious franchise recently celebrated a huge milestone, bringing cast members together to honor more than 2 decades of movies, memories, and one unforgettable bond. Among the familiar faces was Meadow Walker, the daughter of late actor Paul Walker. Her appearance instantly became one of the most emotional moments of the event. After all, Paul wasn't just another actor in the franchise. To millions of fans, he was the heart of it. But Meadow's return didn't just remind people of what was lost. It also raised new questions. Questions about the relationships behind the scenes. Questions about loyalty, grief, and the complicated reality hidden beneath Hollywood's family image. And that's where things started to get interesting. The gathering took place during the Cannes Film Festival in France, where the franchise celebrated its legacy with cast appearances, special events, and news about future projects. Familiar faces like Michelle Rodriguez and Jordana Brewster stood beside Meadow on the red carpet, creating a moment that felt emotional from the very beginning. For Meadow, this wasn't just another celebrity appearance. She was walking back into the world that shaped a huge part of her childhood. A world tied forever to her father. But even surrounded by support, there was a strange feeling hanging in the air. Something unspoken. Something people could sense without fully understanding why. Meadow was only 15 years old when Paul Walker died in 2013. His death shocked the world and changed the franchise forever. Since then, many members of the cast stayed close to her, stepping into her life not just as co-workers of her father, but almost like extended family. Over the years, fans watched that connection grow stronger. But as Meadow became older and more involved in protecting her father's legacy, people began looking more closely at the dynamics inside that circle, especially when it came to Vin Diesel. At first glance, the reunion looked warm and comforting. Cameras flashed. Fans cheered. Cast members embraced. But beneath those polished moments, there seemed to be another layer. Meadow's interactions with Vin Diesel became one of the biggest talking points online. Why? Because while the smiles were there, some fans noticed something more careful underneath. Respect. Yes. Gratitude too. But also distance. And suddenly, people started asking whether the story fans had believed for years was more complicated than they realized. Since her father's passing, Meadow has carried the difficult responsibility of honoring his memory in public while still dealing with private grief. It hasn't been easy. Instead of disappearing from the spotlight, she slowly stepped closer to the franchise that meant so much to Paul. But she did it carefully. Quietly. She never tried to turn herself into a celebrity through his legacy. In fact, her approach has always seemed almost the opposite. Low-key. Respectful. Personal. But why was she suddenly becoming more visible now? That answer surprised many people. In 2023, Meadow appeared in Fast X with a small cameo role. It lasted only a moment on screen, but for longtime fans, it carried enormous emotional weight. She played a simple bartender in a brief scene.
No dramatic introduction.
No attempt to steal attention. Just a quiet appearance meant to honor her father's place in the franchise. Meadow later explained she wanted the cameo to feel subtle, almost like an Easter egg for fans who truly cared. That decision said a lot about how she sees her father's memory. Not as something flashy, but as something deeply personal. Still, her growing involvement also changed the conversation around Paul Walker's legacy. Because for years, much of that public legacy had been shaped by Vin Diesel himself. Vin often described Paul as his brother. He spoke emotionally about their friendship in interviews and at public events. Fans embraced that story completely. To them, VIN became the protector of Paul's memory inside the franchise. But as Meadows stepped forward more openly, some people began wondering whether the full picture was more complicated than the emotional speeches fans had heard for years. And that's where the tension started becoming harder to ignore. The Fast and Furious cast has always described themselves as a family. In many ways, that seems true. After Paul's death, several cast members stayed close to Meadows during some of the hardest years of her life. Jordana Brewster became especially close to her. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Meadows even stayed with Jordana in Los Angeles for a period of time. That relationship wasn't about publicity. It showed how deeply connected the cast remained after all these years. But even strong families have tensions hiding beneath the surface. And sometimes tragedy makes those tensions even more complicated. Vin Diesel's role inside the franchise went far beyond acting. Over time, he became one of its most powerful creative voices. Many major decisions around the series passed through him in some way. That also meant he played a major role in shaping how Paul Walker's legacy was presented publicly. For years, fans accepted that without question. But Meadows' recent appearances created a subtle shift. Not because she directly criticized anyone. She didn't. In fact, she remained polite and measured the entire time. But sometimes silence says more than words ever could. During the Cannes reunion, observers paid close attention to Meadows and Vin's interactions. Their exchanges were respectful, warm at moments, even emotional. But there was also caution there. A carefulness. The kind that makes people wonder what's happening beneath the smiles. Some insiders described Meadows as thoughtful but reserved around VIN. Others noticed body language that hinted at unresolved feelings. Nothing dramatic. Nothing explosive. Just small moments that suggested the relationship may carry more emotional complexity than the public realizes. And once fans started noticing those details, speculation exploded online. Part of the reason this hit people so strongly is because the friendship between Vin Diesel and Paul Walker became one of Hollywood's most beloved stories. Fans wanted to believe it was simple. Two brothers bonded forever by friendship and tragedy. But real relationships are rarely that clean. Especially relationships tied to fame, money, grief, and public image. Meadows' growing role in protecting her father's memory seems to reflect that reality. She appears determined to honor Paul honestly, not mythologize him into something unreal. And that honesty may be quietly changing how the franchise talks about its own history. What makes Meadows' position so difficult is that she exists in two worlds at once. She is both Paul Walker's daughter and a young woman trying to build her own identity. Every public appearance forces her to balance grief with expectation. Fans see her as a living connection to Paul. The franchise sees her as part of its emotional legacy. But Meadows seems increasingly interested in making sure her father's story stays human, not just cinematic. And that shift matters more than people realize. Her appearance in Fast X symbolized that perfectly. The cameo wasn't loud or dramatic because that wasn't the point. It was quiet, personal, real. In many ways, it reflected the humility people often associated with Paul himself. But behind that simple cameo was a bigger message. Meadows Walker was no longer standing on the sidelines. She was stepping directly into the conversation about how her father's memory would be carried forward. And not everyone may see that legacy exactly the same way. What surprised many fans most was how Meadows' presence seemed to subtly challenge the carefully polished narrative surrounding the franchise. Not through conflict, not through accusations, but simply through authenticity. By showing up, by becoming more involved, and by carrying herself with quiet honesty, she reminded people that grief doesn't fit neatly into Hollywood storylines. Families are complicated. Friendships are complicated. Loss changes people. And even the strongest bonds can carry tension beneath the surface. As the reunion continued, it became clear this was about far more than nostalgia. It was about control over memory. About who gets to shape a legacy. About the difference between public tributes and private truths. Vin Diesel may still be one of the strongest voices connected to Paul Walker's memory, but Meadows' growing presence signals something new. A new chapter. One where the people closest to Paul are beginning to tell his story in their own way. And that may change how fans see everything moving forward. In the end, Meadow Walker's reunion with the Fast and Furious family revealed something deeply human. Love and grief can exist beside tension. Loyalty can exist beside disappointment. And honoring someone honestly sometimes means accepting the uncomfortable parts along with the beautiful ones. Meadow didn't need dramatic speeches to make that point. Her presence alone said enough. And maybe that's why this reunion felt so different from every tribute before it.